In the pre-dawn hours of January 24, 2021, a quiet Indianapolis home erupted in chaos and bloodshed. A 15-year-old boy stumbled out of the house on North Adams Street, bleeding from gunshot wounds, and desperately banged on a neighbor's door for help. Inside that home lay the bodies of 5 of his family members. Moments earlier, his dying 42-year-old father had uttered the words, "I'm sorry, Raymond, I love you," a final plea of love to the son who was about to kill him. Upstairs, the boy's 13-year-old sister had screamed in terror, "Raymond shot Elijah," identifying their 17-year-old brother as the shooter, just before more gunfire rang out. By daybreak, 6 lives would be lost, including a young mother-to-be and her unborn baby, in what authorities called the worst mass killing Indianapolis had seen in over a decade. Raymond Ronald Lee Childs III was, by outward appearances, a typical 17-year-old boy. He lived with his father, 42-year-old Raymond Childs Jr., his stepmother Kezzie Childs, 42, his older brother Elijah, 18, younger sister Rita, 13, and Elijah's girlfriend Kiara Hawkins, 19, who was nearly 9 months pregnant. Like many teens, Raymond III sometimes chafed under his parents' rules. On the night of January 23, 2021, he had slipped out of the house to spend time with his girlfriend without permission. When his father discovered his absence, he called Raymond's cell phone and ordered him to come home. Raymond III returned home well after midnight and got into an argument with his parents over his defiance of curfew. According to prosecutors, the conflict began as a routine parent-teen dispute that could happen in any household, a battle over staying out too late, but this one ended in the worst mass killing in Indianapolis in more than a decade.
You're not my fucking mom.
Raymond's father was angry that his son had taken the father's car without permission for this late-night excursion. He told Raymond he was in trouble and that punishment would come the next day. It appears that the prospect of discipline pushed the teen into a deadly rage. Rather than wait to see what his punishment would be, the 17-year-old decided to take matters into his own hands. What happened next was unimaginably brutal. In the dark early hours of January 24th, as most of the family slept, Raymond Childs III armed himself with a high-powered Draco 7.62 semi-automatic firearm, essentially a pistol-sized AK-47, and a 9mm handgun. The first gunshots shattered the pre-dawn silence sometime around 4 a.m. The 15-year-old brother, who had been asleep, was jolted awake by the sound of 2 sudden bangs. He later told investigators that he heard his father jump out of bed and rush toward the staircase, shouting, "What was that?" into the darkness. In the next instant, a panicked cry rang out from young Rita's bedroom. "Raymond shot Elijah." 18-year-old Elijah Childs, Raymond's older brother, had just been gunned down. Before anyone could react further, another shot echoed. In that fleeting moment, the boy's father, Raymond Jr., managed to speak his final words to his eldest son. His voice was filled not with anger, but with sorrow and love. "I'm sorry, Raymond. I love you." It was the last thing the 15-year-old heard his father say before he too was silenced by gunfire. He shot his father and stepmother at the foot of the stairs, cutting down both parents. He turned the Draco's barrel on his little sister, 13-year-old Rita, and shot her next, ending her life almost as soon as she had screamed out Elijah's name. Elijah's girlfriend, Kiara Hawkins, tried to flee or hide. She was 9 months pregnant, just days from her due date. But Raymond showed no mercy. He shot Kiara as well, grievously wounding the young woman and the nearly full-term baby boy she carried. Within minutes, 5 members of the Childs family lay fatally wounded. Only Raymond's 15-year-old younger brother, who had briefly managed to stay out of sight, was still alive in the house. As the gunfire ceased, Xavier Childs realized he might be the only one left. Despite his fear, he knew he had to escape. Xavier crept toward the front door, but his older brother was not finished. Raymond III spotted his youngest sibling trying to get away and pursued him aggressively. Outside on the front porch, under the cold winter sky, Raymond cornered Xavier at gunpoint, In sheer terror, the 15-year-old dropped to his knees and begged for his life. Sobbing and bleeding, he even reached into his pocket and offered all the money he had. "I can give you $40. I won't say nothing. Please don't kill me." The desperate bribe fell on deaf ears. Raymond III looked his little brother in the eyes silently, showing no pity. Then he raised the gun and shot him point blank, hitting Xavier in the leg. As Xavier collapsed in pain, his brother fired again, the second bullet tearing into the boy's arm. Believing he had eliminated every witness to his crime, Raymond III left his brother bleeding on the ground and walked away into the night. Miraculously, Xavier was still alive. Though badly wounded, the teenager's will to survive kicked in. He mustered the strength to drag himself to a neighboring house, leaving a trail of blood in the snow. It was there, pounding on a neighbor's door and crying for help, that police officers found him shortly after 4 a.m. "He shot them all," the boy gasped to the first officers who arrived. When the responders asked who had shot them, the gravely injured teen identified the shooter by name: Raymond Childs, his own brother. Indianapolis Metropolitan Police Department, IMPD, units raced to the Childs family home in the 3500 block of North Adams Street, guided by Xavier's information. Nothing could have prepared the officers for the carnage inside. As they swept through the residence, they found bodies scattered about the whole of the home. In total, 5 victims were found deceased at the scene, and a 6th victim, Kiara Hawkins, was found barely clinging to life despite her critical wounds. Kiara Hawkins was rushed to a hospital, but tragically neither she nor her baby could be saved. This brought the death toll to 6. IMPD Chief Randall Taylor would later note that this was the largest mass casualty shooting in the city in more than a decade. The shock to the community was immense. An entire family, spanning 3 generations, including the unborn child, had been wiped out in minutes over a trivial argument about a teenager's curfew. The sole survivor, 15-year-old Xavier, had lost both parents, 2 siblings, a sister-in-law figure, and an unborn nephew in one night. Chief Taylor urged the Indianapolis community to rally around the surviving boy, as he must come to terms with unimaginable loss. Investigators at the scene recovered a 9mm pistol believed to be one of the murder weapons. Ballistic evidence indicated that 2 firearms had been used in the killings. Not only was the handgun fired, but so was the Draco 7.62 semi-automatic firearm Raymond had used, a weapon that was not left at the scene. It appeared the killer had fled with the Draco still in his possession. Police immediately began a citywide manhunt for Raymond Childs III, who was nowhere to be found at the crime scene. By the time police identified Raymond Childs III as the suspect, the teen was already attempting to cover his tracks and create an alibi. Investigators received a tip about Raymond's whereabouts when community cooperation led investigators to Childs' vehicle, parked at his girlfriend's house. In fact, after the shooting, Raymond had driven off and gone straight back to the home of his 17-year-old girlfriend. This was the same girlfriend with whom he'd tried to spend the night against his parents' wishes. According to the girlfriend's later statements to police, Raymond showed up at her house around 2:30 to 3 a.m., shortly after the murders, carrying 2 bags of clothes and shoes. He told her that his father had kicked him out of the house following their argument. The girlfriend let him in, apparently unaware of the bloodbath that had just occurred. Roughly 30 minutes later, around 4 a.m., news alerts popped up on the girlfriend's phone about a shooting on North Adams Street, the Childs family's street. Alarmed, she showed Raymond the alerts, but he feigned surprise and ignorance. He insisted he knew nothing about any shooting at his family home. As morning broke on January 24th and sirens converged on his neighborhood, Raymond decided to return to the scene, perhaps to see what the police knew. He and his girlfriend drove back to the Adams Street house later that morning. By then, the authorities were swarming the area. At this point, Raymond put on a performance of shock and grief. His girlfriend later recounted that he appeared nervous and then suddenly began crying, acting hysterical, essentially acting like a clown, in her words, upon seeing the police at his home. He played the role of the distraught son who had just discovered his family murdered, attempting to deflect any suspicion that he was, in fact, the murderer. But Raymond's charade did not last long. Thanks to Xavier's identification of his brother as the shooter, police already had an all-points bulletin out for Raymond Childs III. As officers canvassed the area, they learned from relatives that Raymond might be headed to or hiding with extended family. Indeed, after briefly stopping at the crime scene, Raymond went to a relative's residence in the nearby suburb of Plainfield. His extended family there was already aware something terrible had happened. At some point soon after his arrival, family members confronted Raymond and managed to take away his gun. In an extraordinary act of integrity, Raymond's own relatives secured the suspected murder weapon and handed it over to law enforcement within hours of the killings. This weapon was presumably the Draco 7.62 firearm, since the 9mm pistol had been left at the house. Later that same day, just one day after the massacre, police moved in and arrested Raymond Childs III at the Plainfield relative's home without incident. The 17-year-old suspect was taken into custody, ending the brief manhunt. In initial interviews, Raymond reportedly tried to cast blame elsewhere. He told some family members that some people from the next block must have broken in and murdered his family, but investigators were not fooled. They had a surviving eyewitness, physical evidence linking Raymond to the crime, and even Raymond's own bizarre behavior working against him. On January 28, 2021, just 4 days after the killings, the Marion County prosecutor formally charged Raymond Ronald Lee Childs III with 6 counts of murder, 1 count of attempted murder for shooting Xavier, and 1 count of carrying a handgun without a license. Although he was only 17, Indiana law allowed the teen to be charged as an adult given the severity of his crimes. At 17, he was too young to face the death penalty, but he now stood to spend the rest of his life in prison if convicted. The tragedy had swiftly shifted into the arena of justice, and the case against Raymond Childs III appeared overwhelming. Still, the legal process would take time, and not a little drama before reaching its conclusion. For over 3 years, Raymond Childs III awaited trial while the case slowly wound through the court system. The evidence against him was strong, and in October 2022, he even gave a recorded rap performance from jail bragging about shooting and killing with guns. A chilling incident noted by prosecutors as relevant to his case. His defense attorneys, meanwhile, maintained his plea of not guilty and prepared to challenge the prosecution's narrative. The first trial finally began in the summer of 2024 in a Marion County courtroom. By then, Raymond was 20 years old, appearing before a jury on charges of annihilating his own family. The prosecution's case included ballistic forensics, the testimony of surviving brother Xavier, now 18 and the key eyewitness, statements from Raymond's girlfriend and other relatives, and a detailed probable cause affidavit recounting the horrific sequence of events. Emotions ran high as family members and friends of the victims packed the courtroom. Even some of Raymond's own relatives attended, struggling to comprehend how a member of their family could commit such an atrocity. Midway through that first trial, an explosive courtroom incident derailed the proceedings. Raymond's cousin, Alonso Valles, was called to testify for the prosecution. Valles had been close to Raymond and had even helped him in the immediate aftermath of the murders, not realizing what Raymond had done. He recounted how in the early morning hours of January 24, 2021, just after the killings, he had picked Raymond up and driven him around Indianapolis to give him a place to cool off. Raymond ended up at Valles' home in Plainfield, the same house where he'd later be arrested. Valles testified that during that time, Raymond covered his eyes and wept while lying on a bed at Valles' house. This suggested that, at least in private, Raymond showed some emotional breakdown after killing his family, although whether it was remorse, shock, or self-pity was unclear. Then came the moment that would stop the trial in its tracks. As he recounted those memories on the witness stand, Alonso Velez suddenly broke from his testimony and addressed Raymond directly in open court. Turning to face his cousin, the accused, Velez blurted out, "Y'all remember that?" The courtroom fell silent, and before the attorneys or judge could intervene, Velez continued with an anguished demand. "Why did you do it, Raymond?" Gasps were heard around the courtroom. This was a direct confrontation from a witness to the defendant in front of the jury, and it was highly improper during a trial. Pandemonium briefly erupted as prosecutors and defense counsel alike jumped up, and the judge urgently instructed the jury to disregard the outburst. The damage, however, was done. The defense immediately moved for a mistrial, arguing that the cousin's emotional question, essentially asking Raymond to confess or explain himself in front of the jury, had irreparably prejudiced the proceedings. Judge Chris Miller was left with little choice. After ushering the shaken jurors out and questioning each one individually about the incident, the judge lamented that he was firmly convinced that Mr. Childs cannot get a fair trial under these circumstances. On July 23, 2024, Judge Miller declared a mistrial, abruptly ending the first attempt at bringing Raymond Childs III to justice. It was a bitter setback for the victim's family members, who would now have to endure the pain of a second trial. But they understood that the integrity of the judicial process had to be maintained. The court scheduled a new trial for the fall of 2024, determined that this time nothing would derail the quest for justice. The retrial of Raymond Childs III commenced in October 2024 under careful guidelines to prevent any further disruptions. This time, the prosecution and witnesses stuck strictly to the script of evidence. The heart-wrenching testimony of Xavier Childs, the sole surviving brother, provided a narrative spine for the case. Jurors were shown the physical evidence, the recovered 9mm handgun, the ballistics match to the Draco firearm, and crime scene photos illustrating the carnage in each room. The prosecution painted a picture of Raymond Childs III as a family annihilator who acted out of teenage rage and entitlement. The defense, for its part, tried to cast doubt on whether Raymond was truly the shooter. They pointed out the lack of any video or DNA evidence directly tying him to the trigger, suggesting the possibility, however remote, that an unknown assailant could have committed the murders. They emphasized that Raymond had no prior violent criminal history. The defense also noted that he was only 17 at the time, implicitly arguing that perhaps a moment of adolescent anger had spiraled out of control without premeditation. However, these arguments found little traction. The sheer weight of evidence and the testimony of Xavier, whose survivor's account was both harrowing and unwavering, left little room for reasonable doubt. The jury knew that Xavier had identified his brother as the killer immediately after the crime, when the boy was in extreme pain but lucid enough to say, "He shot them all." That kind of spontaneous identification is powerful. Moreover, Raymond's behavior following the murders, fleeing the scene, lying about it, pretending to grieve, hiding the weapon, looked exactly like consciousness of guilt, not the actions of an innocent person shocked by someone else's violence. After a 5-day trial, on October 25, 2024, the case went to the jury. It didn't take long. In less than 3 hours of deliberation, the jury returned with a verdict of guilty on all counts. Raymond Childs III, now 21 years old, was convicted of 6 counts of murder, 1 count of attempted murder, and 1 count of carrying a handgun without a license. Family members in the courtroom quietly embraced and let out sighs of relief as the verdict was read. Justice had at last caught up with Raymond for his horrific crimes. This conviction came several months after the first hearing of his case was ruled a mistrial, as the press noted, but ultimately the system prevailed. With the guilty verdict delivered, only the sentencing remained. Raymond Childs III faced the prospect of spending the rest of his life behind bars. Under Indiana law, each murder count can carry decades in prison, and the judge had the option to stack the sentences consecutively. Because Raymond was a juvenile at the time of the offense, A death sentence was off the table, and even life without parole was legally complicated. Instead, prosecutors pushed for an extremely long term of years that would ensure the now 21-year-old would never walk free again. On March 10, 2025, the families of the victims packed the courtroom once more, this time for the sentencing hearing. Raymond Childs III sat before the bench awaiting his fate. When given a chance to speak, Raymond, who had now
just
been
as I sit here
incarcerated
4 years
for
ago,
over
I'm
40
innocent.
years, still showed no remorse for his actions. Instead of an apology, he chose to proclaim his innocence once again. Looking out at the people gathered, a number of them his own surviving relatives, it was a defiant declaration that rang hollow against the evidence and the verdict. Those in attendance, including prosecutors and police, noted that Raymond displayed zero contrition. He still refused to accept any responsibility for annihilating his family. The judge did not mince words when delivering the sentence. Citing the cold-blooded and brutal nature of the murders, the judge emphasized how Raymond had not even spared a child or an unborn baby in his rampage. In total, Raymond Childs III was sentenced to 360 years in prison. This was calculated as 55 years for each of the 6 murders, plus 30 years for the attempted murder of Xavier, with the terms to be served one after the other. Effectively, it was a life sentence many times over, far beyond Raymond's natural lifespan. The rest of his life will now likely be spent behind bars. In his remarks on the sentencing, prosecutor Ryan Mears underscored the magnitude of Raymond's crimes. The defendant brutally murdered 6 people: his father, stepmother, older brother, younger sister, his older brother's girlfriend, and her unborn child, Mears stated, listing the loved ones whose lives were taken. There is no penalty that could ever reflect the harm and unimaginable loss caused by the defendant's actions, he added, acknowledging that no amount of prison time could truly make up for what was lost. Indeed, the judge's severe sentence was largely symbolic, a message that such an atrocity warranted the harshest punishment possible under the law, even if it could never restore the lives that were taken. As Raymond Childs III was led away in handcuffs to begin serving his 360-year sentence, those left behind were left to grapple with complicated emotions. On one hand, there was relief. The justice system had worked, and the man responsible for the slaughter of the Childs family would never be free to hurt anyone again. On the other hand, there was no joy in this outcome, only sadness and exhaustion. A young man who should have been part of the family's future was now forever condemned for destroying it. Outside the courthouse, a relative of the Childs family spoke softly to reporters, reflecting on the tragedy. "We not only lost 6 beautiful souls that day, we lost Raymond too," the family member said, lamenting how a moment of fury from a teenager had blossomed into a lifetime of grief for everyone involved. The mass murder of the Childs family sent shockwaves through Indianapolis and beyond. In the immediate aftermath, a community vigil was held for the victims. Neighbors and friends left flowers, candles, and stuffed animals on the front lawn of the Adams Street home in memory of 13-year-old Rita and the unborn baby who never got to take a first breath. IMPD Chief Randall Taylor and other officials urged the community to support Xavier, the boy who lost his entire family, as he recovered from his injuries and trauma. Miraculously, Xavier did survive his gunshot wounds after multiple surgeries. He was placed in the care of relatives and, in the years that followed, has tried to rebuild some semblance of a life. Now a young adult, Xavier carries not just physical scars, but deep emotional ones. By bravely testifying in court, he ensured that his family's voices were heard and that the brother who betrayed them was held accountable. Many people have struggled to comprehend how a mundane dispute about a sleepover with a girlfriend could explode into such extreme violence. Psychologists note that cases of family annihilators, especially involving a teenager killing parents and siblings, are exceptionally rare. Prosecutor Mears pointed out that nothing about what happened was fathomable, not in 2021 when it happened, and not even years later. This was not a case with a long history of documented abuse or madness leading up to the killings. It was, by all accounts, an ordinary family argument that, in a split second, crossed a line into monstrous brutality. Raymond Childs III's youth, 17, did not excuse his actions, but it highlighted the shocking reality that someone so young could destroy so much over something so trivial as a house rule. As the Fatal Family Network and other observers recount this story, the focus remains on the victims and the survivor. 6 beloved family members lost their lives at the hands of one of their own. A father who tried to discipline his son, a stepmother who treated Raymond like her own, a big brother who just wanted to hang out with friends, a little sister who adored her siblings, a young woman excited to become a mother, and a baby who would never be born. All were brutally taken in minutes. The case of Raymond Childs III stands as a grim reminder of how a moment of unchecked anger and access to guns can destroy an entire family in the blink of an eye. Even the judge who handed down the sentence acknowledged that there is no true closure in a case like this. Raymond will live out his days in prison, likely behind bars for the rest of his life. But the survivors will live out their days with grief and trauma. The Childs family massacre remains one of Indianapolis's darkest chapters. It is a story of a family that should have been safe in their own home, torn apart from within by one of their own. And it is a story of a community that came together, from the police and prosecutors to brave witnesses like Xavier and even relatives of the killer, to ensure that unspeakable tragedy was answered with justice.